The first presidential debate skips gun policy, plus the fallout from the Supreme Court's Rahimi decision begins. All this and more on the news update.
No, the devil's got no hold on me.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the news update, hosted by TheReload.com. I'm contributing writer Jake Fogleman, joined as always by Reload founder Stephen Gutowski. And of course, TheReload.com is where you can head on over and sign up for our free weekly newsletter, keep you up to date on all things happening in the world of gun politics and policy. But to start us off this week, I think we want to talk about the first presidential debate that happened last night between current President Joe Biden and former President Donald Trump. And there's a lot that could be said about how that debate went, but I think one of the top line things for our purposes is sort of the absence, once again, of gun discussions.
Yeah, no gun policy at last night's debate. A lot of other things, like you said, we could talk about. Man, maybe we will at the end to just give some personal reactions. I don't know. But as far as our wheelhouse here, gun policy, gun politics, it didn't come up. No questions were asked about gun policy, and neither of the candidates tried to bring it up themselves. I was a little bit surprised that didn't happen one way or the other, especially on Biden's side, to be honest, because he's been making gun control a more prominent part of his reelection campaign, his effort to seemingly to try and inspire more enthusiasm from his own base voters, from people who want to see, for instance, AR-15s banned or universal background checks or whatever. He's been trying to put that at a higher level of political awareness for the public. And, he's done things like give a speech his first time at Everytown's national conference. He did that kind of bizarrely right after his son was convicted of federal gun crimes. Of course, that was the timing of it was rather odd, but he did do it, which maybe indicates even more how much his campaign seems to value those voters. And then of course he had it. He had an ad, right, that focused on gun control as well. So it's been something that he's been centering on more and more of late, and he didn't try to fit it in at all in this debate.
Yeah, that was sort of my top line takeaway for the absence of gun policy, because like you said, we ran a piece, I think it was a week or two ago, about that ad. It came out shortly after the bump stock decision. So he's clearly putting campaign dollars into making gun policy visible. We also saw some mainstream media coverage. I think it was the AP had a story, and I think we linked to it in one of our newsletters, about how they're making gun policy a concerted, a primary focus for getting out suburban swing voters, particularly suburban women, who I guess the campaign thinks is going to help. That's an issue that's going to help bring him on board and put him over the edge against Trump. And so the fact that, this was all swirling sort of in the zeitgeist, and it didn't come up at all during the first time that these two squared off, and it's a big point of difference between the two. I think that's interesting. Obviously, it could have been overshadowed by the fact that it was just a very bizarre debate. And like you said, maybe we can get into some of that discussion a little bit later.
A little bit about it at the end, just some personal reactions to the debate itself. But look, it's also an issue where they have a stark contrast between the two candidates, for sure. And there's quite a lot to talk about. I mean, policy on the policy front, and then on like the practical implications of the pro-gun candidate not being able to own guns. There's, the Biden running, I think, the farthest left on the issue that you've seen a Democrat run since at least Bill Clinton. And, none of that stuff came up. Now, look, it's not a top tier issue in the campaign. Right. If you look at polling, and guns are usually a mid-tier issue outside of, so major events or specific legislation. So it's not surprising to me that this didn't get, led with as one of the top questions or anything like that, or that it didn't make it at all into the debate, because there's a lot of other things to cover, especially in this election with these two particular candidates. But Trump didn't try to bring it up either. So you could make the same case his way. He hasn't done as much. His campaign hasn't done as much to emphasize the issue beyond appearing at NRA events, essentially. He's done 2 of those. He's supposed to do another one at some point. At least that's what the NRA said during their last annual meeting, the board meeting. So, it hasn't been necessarily a hallmark part of his campaign either. I think that's why I was a little more surprised that Biden didn't try to bring it up, because his campaign has emphasized it much more in recent weeks than the Trump campaign has. But we can't talk too much about this aspect because the takeaway is that they didn't talk about it, which this happened with the primaries too, right? The Republican primary, we didn't see it. It seemed like an issue that was perhaps even more salient then, because there was some vulnerabilities to Trump's right that could have been exploited by, people like Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. And he seemed to set himself up to do that with, signing a number of program pieces of legislation, and then just never did. And so that may be one of the themes of this election when it comes to guns, is they just kind of stay at the rear as far as issue importance goes.
Yeah, it certainly looks that way, at least so far. But getting on to some of the other stories we have this week, we have some ongoing fallout from the Supreme Court's Rahimi decision, which obviously we covered last week. But the big news this week is that the DOJ apparently does not think Rahimi provided a whole lot of clarity when it comes to felon in possession laws in particular. Obviously, we've talked about the fact that the Range case, which deals with the person that is suing to get his gun rights back, he was convicted of a misdemeanor offense about 30 years ago, but it was punishable by more than a year in prison. And because of that, he no longer has gun rights. And the Third Circuit said that the felon in possession ban was unconstitutional as applied to him. And then there's a whole host of similar challenges sort of percolating through the lower courts at the moment. And the DOJ just filed a brief with the Supreme Court, essentially asking them, don't grant, vacate, and remand those cases, or we would prefer you didn't. We prefer you actually take these cases because we need some clarity now on whether or not that law is constitutional.
Yeah, I think a lot of people would prefer that. Both sides would probably prefer the court to take up these cases, because Rahimi, has a lot of implications. It's the first case where the court itself has applied the Second Amendment test it made in Bruin. So it's important for that reason alone. But the holding is fairly narrow from the majority. And that's what the DOJ is sort of complaining about here. And so it does leave a lot of questions unanswered. And Gorsuch noted that in his concurrence, and so did Jackson, noted that in her concurrence. So not surprised to see the DOJ try to push forward, because they won Rahimi, right, on the merits, maybe not as broadly as they wanted to, but they did win. So they're trying to push their advantage. And at the same time, I wouldn't be surprised if gun rights advocates would be happy to see them take up, especially Range, right? That's one everybody on the gun rights side wants the court to take up, because it's kind of the polar opposite of Rahimi, in the sense that the defendant is extremely sympathetic compared to Rahimi, who is extremely unsympathetic. So, we'll see what happens. But DOJ wasn't the only one that was unhappy with the outcome of Rahimi, or at least unsatisfied, displeased by it. You had a piece this week, a member's piece, where you looked at the one dissent in Rahimi, which was a pretty important dissent because it came from the person who wrote the Bruin decision, who wrote the test that they were applying in Rahimi. And so Justice Clarence Thomas wrote a very lengthy dissent where he complained about how the majority, including the 5 other conservative justices, were applying his test. Can you just give us a brief overview of that?
Yeah. So like you said, top line finding, you see an 8-1 decision, you think, this was a very clear outcome. But I think there's something noteworthy when the fact that, like you said, it's the first time the court's applied its Bruin test. And the guy that actually authored that Bruin test and put it on paper is saying, oh, you actually did this completely wrong, and this is unacceptable. There's something to that. So basically his chief complaint was how they applied. Obviously the Bruin test involves when the Second Amendment's plain text is implicated by a law, you have to go back to the historical tradition of gun regulation. And if it comports with that, then maybe it can pass muster. And so the majority, we talked about they found surety laws and what they call affray laws, which means, they were laws that criminalized people going armed to the terror of the people. And they sort of said, there's aspects of the surety laws that are fairly similar to this modern day domestic violence restraining order ban because it's temporary and it's someone that's suspected of being a potential future harm. That's how sureties were applied back in the day. And that's sort of how a domestic violence restraining order works. And then, criminalizing someone going armed to the terror of the people is, it's applying a criminal law to someone causing harm with a firearm. And because of those aspects, we can sort of piece together a historical tradition that's roughly in line with the modern ban. And Thomas said, you can't do that. He said, I want to find the quote because it basically complains that it's a piecemeal approach. You can't stitch together something to make a tradition. There's no single law that matches. There's no single law that's analogous to the modern day ban. And therefore, I would dissent. And so, something to be said for that if the guy that wrote the test says he did it wrong.
Yeah. And he said that perhaps the surety laws have a similar why as to, why the person was being restrained, but they had a different how they went about restraining their gun rights or restraining them. And he was upset at this mix and match approach that the court took. In fact, so upset that he was essentially saying it undermines the Bruen test altogether and the Second Amendment. He was pretty stark in his warning about how the majority was applying this. He really took it as the court severely weakening the Bruen test to the point of making it irrelevant. So that's a pretty big charge from, again, the guy who wrote the original test. Of course, the other justices responded to this, from the liberals on the court to the majority itself to, Gorsuch. And, essentially they seem to, other than the liberals who I think would like to see Bruen made irrelevant, right? I think that was a takeaway from their concurrences, not dissents. But as far as the majority and the Gorsuch concurrence go, I think they were just basically saying Thomas is blowing things out of proportion, right? That, more or less. Paraphrase what their argument was.
That's essentially what it was. Roberts tried to, he actually directly referred to Thomas's critiques by name and then tried to explain how actually, no, we didn't. How is the same. And it's, it's because you can criminalize, you can put someone in jail that could be incarcerated for violating affray laws. And that's similar. Justice Gorsuch as well said, I respect that my dissenter sees things a little bit differently, but I think we actually faithfully applied Bruen. Basically, the theme was it's just a difference of interpretation, but we're not running away wholesale from Bruen. Text and history are very important to us. Every single concurrence that was filed by a conservative judge essentially made that same point. So they don't see it as a step back from Bruen. Thomas clearly thinks they went in that direction, but at least all the other judges or justices, I think that's noteworthy, the fact that they went out of their way to say, we're not going away from text, history, and tradition. It's the proper role for judges to do that. Interest balancing and trying to weigh policy arguments is not our proper role. So they clearly went out of their way to say, we're not backing away from the Bruen tests. It's just that I think we're applying it a little bit differently.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that was the message that you got from Gorsuch and Kavanaugh and Barrett and Roberts. And Alito didn't say anything. So
that was interesting.
We don't really know what he's thinking, but he joined the majority. So he must agree pretty closely with what was written there. Because again, he didn't write a concurrence or whatever. So, I think Thomas's warnings, and I wrote about this as well in a member's piece, they carry some weight if the court doesn't take up a sort of anti-Rahimi case. I talked about how Range is sort of the polar opposite of Rahimi as far as defendant goes, but it's not really an anti-Rahimi case because Rahimi, the big concern the majority had was that the Fifth Circuit, the lower court, was too strictly applying Bruen standard. That was the outcome of their decision. And that's basically what they were saying about Thomas as well and how he looked at the case. That they wanted a broader approach to finding historical analogs or historical tradition than what the Fifth Circuit went with. And so, if they don't take an anti-Rahimi case, in other words, a lower court case where the lower court, perhaps the Ninth Circuit, which is kind of the polar opposite of the Fifth Circuit in many situations, where they took too loose of an approach to applying Bruin. If they don't do that, if they don't come up with an anti-Rahimi case at some point in the relatively near future, I think a lot of Thomas's warnings may come true at that point. If they decide this, if they do what they did with, for instance, Heller and McDonald, they had Heller, they had McDonald. 2 years later, they applied Heller to the states, and then they kind of left things alone for over a decade. And according to the court itself, that caused a lot of lower courts to just kind of ignore what they'd held in Heller. And so if they do Bruin and then they do this Rahimi case where they're sort of broadening the potential scope of what a historical tradition is that, as it applies to modern gun laws, and then they don't take any other cases for a decade, you may have the effect that Thomas is warning about, where lower courts will just be comfortable with going very loose in their search for historical tradition to uphold modern gun regulations. So I don't know. We'll see how it shakes out. There are probably, the Illinois assault weapons ban cases are the ones right now that are perhaps the closest to an anti-Rahimi case. As you've written about in the past, the justifications they've used in the lower courts to uphold those gun bans are pretty loose as far as what they're identifying as historical analogs. So if the court takes one of those and says, okay, look, Rahimi, it was too strict. These Illinois cases is too loose. We need to find that Goldilocks approach. And here's how you do it. We're gonna put guardrails on either side. If they just put guardrails on one side, you get a different outcome, I think.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think it's worth noting that Thomas's warnings were already going on in the lower courts. Like you point out, there were courts already doing a loose interpretation of Bruin. And it, like you said, it just comes down to whether or not the Supreme Court is going to decide to allow that going forward. And we'll have to see. We'll wait and see what they do. But speaking of other Supreme Court news, just this morning, right before we recorded, actually, they just decided the Loper Bright case and officially overturned the Chevron. So Chevron deference is no more. Remains to be seen yet what that's going to mean in ATF cases, gun-related cases, but certainly it intersects with regulatory deference and giving administrative agencies leeway to interpret their regulations. So,
right,
could be big news.
It should, right? You would think it has, because it should have an effect on pretty much every federal agency, because Chevron was a standard where if the law is ambiguous, the courts are supposed to default to an agency's interpretation of the law over its own interpretation, essentially. And so they've been carving away at that for a while, but now they've officially completely overturned it. So you would think that's bound to have some effect on at least some ATF regulations. I do think some people may overplay this a bit because as far as I understand it, none of these major cases in recent years, like the Biden ATF rules or the Trump bump stock ban, came down to Chevron deference, because at least some of the lower courts were finding that these are criminal penalties. It's not as common to apply Chevron deference in that situation. So I don't know how much of an impact it will have on some of these higher profile things. I think Cargill itself will have the bigger impact on those cases, because that's likely how the court is going to approach deciding them. The ghost gun kit ban, the pistol brace ban, in the business rule, those sorts of things. But, I would imagine, especially on the more industry side of the ATF's regulations, where there's less of a criminal penalty involved and more of a civil effect, it probably could have some significant impact there. And just honestly, it'll make it easier to sue. I think that's the bottom line. Like, the courts will still have to decide who's right. They just won't be giving deference to the federal agencies as much anymore, right? I mean, this is all about the APA, the Administrative Procedures Act, which is what the bump stock case was decided on. So instead of using deference to the agency, they'll do what the Supreme Court did in Cargo, which is like look at the law, try to decide whether the ATF has a better case or the people suing them.
Yeah. It's a worthwhile point, the fact that the ATF hasn't even really been invoking Chevron in a lot of these recent challenges.
Yeah.
But I think just the fact that they were willing to overturn this precedent just speaks to a continued posture from this court where they're just broadly skeptical of agency power, regardless of whether. Yeah. So I think it's just another notch in that continuing trend where, we've seen the EPA case, the bump stock case. Now they're overturning Chevron. There clearly is a court that's skeptical of administrative agencies.
They don't like when
reaching a little bit.
They don't like when they go beyond what's in the text of the law. That seems to be pretty clear. They don't want the agencies to just be exercising their own judgment on these things beyond what's authorized by Congress. That seems to be their general worldview on how to approach administrative power.
But we will, of course, stay on top of whether or not the Chevron reversal in particular has an impact on these future cases. Getting into another story we wrote this week is one you had about the latest fundraising numbers from all the major gun groups. And we actually had a little bit of a change this time because at this point, the NRA actually bounced back a little bit and outraised the gun control groups.
It did. The NRA not only brought in a significant amount more than it did the previous month. We're talking about May's numbers here. They just came out. These come out, about half a month after the fundraiser, the month is over. But the NRA both increased its haul for the political arm. This is their political action committee. It's called the Political Victory Fund at the NRA. And we're comparing these numbers against all of the other groups' political action committees, because those are the ones that are required to report their fundraising to and their spending to the Federal Elections Commission. Right. So those are the groups that we're looking at, but they increased their haul and they beat the gun control groups combined for the first time this year. Actually, they used to beat them all the time. Right. This was a common thing where the NRA would, even going back to like 2022, not that long ago. But you go back to like 2016, they were just had a huge cash advantage compared to the gun control groups. But even in 2020, they had an advantage. I think 2018 is the only time where the gun control groups have outspent the NRA in an election cycle. But this year they'd been outraising them the whole year. And now that's reversed. And this came in May, which also happens to be the time when reformers won most of the leadership roles at the NRA. So it may coincide with that. These PACs, they can only raise money from NRA members. And so it may be an indication that NRA members are willing to give a little more than they were previously. But they, so this is good news. It's good news for the NRA, right? It's another spot of good news for them after a long series of bad news over the last several years. And so it's a positive takeaway for the organization. I don't want to overplay it too much, right? Because the thing is, they're still way off their pace from previous election cycles, 2020 and 2016, by a significant amount. They raised somewhere north of 600,000 this month, or in May, and they were over $1 million in the previous election cycle. So they're not really close. And this is only their second best month this year, so it wasn't even a record for this year so far. But again, like I said, it was a rebound. I mean, the month before that, April, they actually, not only were they being outraised by the combined likes of Everytown, Giffords, and Brady, but Giffords alone, the Giffords PAC alone, outraised the NRA in April. So this is a pretty big reversal for the NRA in a pretty short time. And obviously it's just 1 month, but we reported on it every other month where they've been outraised by the gun control groups. So we're reporting on it when it goes the other way too, of course.
Yeah. Like you said, it's an interesting indication that maybe you're starting to see some people feel comfortable to start donating again like they have in the past.
Maybe.
We don't know that for a fact, obviously, but it obviously coincides with at least a symbolic change in direction of the group where they cleaned house at the leadership level. So we'll have to see if that continues. And, like you said, they're still a ways off from their past strong years. So you can't draw too strong a conclusion, but it's at least a positive shift for them.
And they still have a long way to go in the whole internal fight reform thing.
Right.
It's not those leadership elections didn't resolve everything. There's still turmoil inside the organization from what I'm being told by board members and what I've seen board members like Willis Lee say publicly. So we'll see. We'll see what happens. They also are still facing that trial in July. Middle of July is going to be the beginning of the second phase of that New York civil corruption trial. So they still have a ways to go before they're back totally on their feet. And it's not a given that's going to happen. But again, it's a good sign.
Yeah. But getting into some of our newsletter links, and speaking of the NRA, we have one from our friend Cam Edwards at Bearing Arms, covering something that the NRA actually posted on their ILA website, which is their political arm. They had an interesting post about the
different political arm. That's the C4. Right, I know this stuff gets confusing because most of these big political organizations are made up of like 6 different legal entities. So the PAC is different from the Institute for Legislative Action, but they both are involved in politics.
Right. This is more their lobbying arm, where they had a post about the felon in possession ban, which we were talking about at the top of the show here, where they expressed openness to revisiting whether or not that should be allowed to stand. For a lot of maybe listeners here that are if they're gun rights activists or they follow gun rights activism, that may not be too much of a shock because there's been plenty of gun rights groups that for years now have at least been critical of nonviolent felons not being allowed to own guns. But to date, I'm not sure we've seen the NRA take really a position on that. And to see them express some openness, I think is notable.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, the NRA has traditionally been a very tough on crime organization where they pair their gun rights message with a message about cracking down on gun crime. And I do think this is perhaps a sign of the more libertarian leaning groups having influence over the NRA and having a significant influence over the activist space. This is, like you said, it's a very common position among gun rights activists that at the very least, nonviolent felons or even users of illicit drugs, especially something like marijuana, that they question the effectiveness or even constitutionality of those prohibitions. So, the NRA expressing openness to that is interesting for sure.
And then another link we want to hit on today comes to us from Meat Eater. And it's an interesting story about sort of the change in Form 4 approvals. So NFA items, suppressors in particular is what this story covers, and how the approval times have increased by about 5,000%. They've improved about 5,000%. So some people are getting them same day, which is, if anyone has followed how long that usually takes, that is insane. And just some interesting details where the reporter in this case talked to the head of the suppressor organization, tried to get some detail about why they think this change happened. And it just has to do with, it seems like some bureaucratic cleaning out some of the bureaucratic hurdles that previously happened. I guess Steve Dettelbach being the permanent head of the ATF helped as well. So that's a little bit of an interesting nugget as well.
Yeah, they also digitized the process not long ago. So I think that certainly helped speed things up. But I think there was even an issue that they talk about where if one application was delayed, that it would hold up all of the other applications in the entire country. So there was clearly some bureaucratic nonsense going on at the ATL, which is no surprise, I think, for anyone dealing with any government agency, but especially one that's regulating a product that maybe a lot of people in political leadership don't like too, is probably the other half of it. But yeah, I mean, it's the way they've been able to actually improve that process so much is fascinating, but it probably also speaks to just like it could have been like this all along, or at least for many years before now.
Right.
So it's a positive development, one that makes you think, hey, why was it so bad for so long?
Yeah. It's an interesting story, though, and listeners should check it out because it provides some interesting detail behind the scenes.
Especially when the NICS checks for buying an actual gun. A suppressor is a literal tube of metal. That's what it is. It's the same technology as your muffler. And, whatever, it's heavily regulated under the National Firearms Act in the United States. And that's is what it is. But like, we sell actual firearms that actually shoot bullets much faster than we do suppressors. And it seems there was no good reason why that was the case.
Yeah, it's a good point. It is a good point. And the last link we want to hit on today is just a story from the Trace, sort of the ongoing legal fights over the SIG and their P320 pistol. And there's been a lot of lawsuits in the last couple of years with people alleging that it fires on its own, or, they had those famous drop safety issue in the past. But now people are saying even with new triggers that SIG was putting in those weapons, they're still having problems with negligent discharges. And we actually have a Georgia jury finding SIG liable in one of those cases. So I think that's notable.
Yeah, kind of surprising too, because from what reading the piece and the details of the case, some of these because the Trace and the Post did a whole investigation that where they found a lot of incidents. And look, the 320 is sold probably millions of units by this point. So I think any gun is going to have some level of reports of negligent discharges where people blame the gun and not themselves. But there were a few that had videos that, where the gun goes off in interesting circumstances, and no one seems to be touching the trigger area. Some of them, it's like, okay, this gets jostled around, and we can't tell exactly why. Maybe the trigger did get pulled by something. This case didn't seem to involve video of the incident happening. It's just the plaintiff and his what he claimed, which was that he was taking the guy a holstered 320 out of his pants when it went off. I'm always super skeptical of the gun went off claims, but it's not impossible that could happen. And clearly this jury sided with the plaintiff. So it's kind of fascinating to see. And you wonder if that will be replicated in a lot of the other cases. Especially, one of the things too is like, I don't think most juries have a expert level understanding of how guns operate or what the guns say, the safeties in modern firearms. But, to be fair, that's what you're supposed to do during the trial, is show them all this. If you're SIG, you're supposed to defend yourself by showing why this couldn't happen the way you said or whatnot. And so the jury came out against them this time. And we'll have to see if that continues. The 320 has gotten a lot of bad reputation over these claims in the last several years. So this one certainly doesn't help.
Yeah, no, I think that's the biggest takeaway is we don't know the particulars of this specific claim of negligent discharge, but there certainly are a lot of them. And there are a lot of lawsuits that are similar to this all across the country. And you never, maybe bad news for SIG if more and more juries are willing to find liability on the company.
Yeah. Like I said, I'm always super skeptical of the gun went off claims, but
yeah,
it doesn't mean it can't happen. And there have been, of course, guns that were defective from the factory. Even extremely popular guns. The Remington 700, right, had a safety issue for a long time. And a lot of guns have had to be recalled, not recalled, but like they'll do these like a lot of car companies do it, right, where it's like, oh, you should maybe come in and get this changed, but it's not, we're not admitting we did anything wrong. And it's not necessarily the easiest thing to figure out what's true or not in these circumstances. And but in this case, the jury decided against SIG, and bad news for them for sure. But I don't know. I think that's all we've got in terms of the news. Just getting back to the debate real quick, just on the personal reaction side, and I don't know how much you want to feel obligated to share too much if you don't want to. But to me, watching that debate was brutal. I mean, boy, that's got to be the worst debate I've ever seen. I think, watching those two candidates and how they performed was just all. And clearly, I think Biden performed worse. He had his sort of almost worst case scenario debate, because the big problem everybody has with Biden is his top thing knock against him. Not that it's the only one, right? I don't want to get too far down the rabbit hole with this stuff. It's not what we do necessarily, but just he's old. He's very old. A lot of people think he's too old to be president, and he went in there and he had a number of senior moments where he wasn't coherent, and it was brutal to watch, right?
Yeah.
And then maybe you can overcome that. Maybe you can still overcome it. I don't know. A lot of people want to replace him. Wouldn't be surprised if that happened, because we've been living through a bunch of years here where we're in unprecedented scenarios.
It's a good point.
We're living in very interesting times. So, Trump was just the first to be convicted of a felony as former president. He was still running and is the front runner currently. And now we could have Biden drop out. I don't know.
Yeah,
I don't know what's going to happen.
I was going to say the conventional wisdom would say it's insane to have an incumbent president get pulled out, but we're not living in conventional times, which is a great point.
It's just crazy that these are the guys that these parties put up. I cannot believe it. I just feel so disconnected from either one of these parties. I don't want to see either one in control personally of anything. Just, my God, what are we doing? Because I don't think Trump had a good debate either. Like, I don't think he did well. The problem is that Biden did so poorly that's what everyone's talking about, justifiably so. And it just made me, I was just sitting there watching those two on screen. It was
tough to watch.
It was very tough to watch. To feel very unhappy about where we've landed as a nation. I mean, it puts certainly Trump back. Obviously we don't know exactly what is going to come of this. It is a super early debate. Usually debates are like a month or two before the election instead of, way out in June. Maybe that was on purpose to try and, because if they both agreed to it. So I don't know, but in theory, he could get over the hill and come back. And I think he'd have to go out and do so many speeches and interviews to show that this was some sort of fluke but of course, the problem is, I think any one reasonable person looking at Joe Biden over the last several years knows this isn't like a fluke that this happened, right? Like, he can be cognizant, he can be coherent, but you can just look at him. He's very old. You can see him walking around. It's not. So the fact that that's what got emphasized in his poor debate performance is such a bad thing for him, because he was already, there was a bit of a toss up with Trump mostly doing him in polling generally, not by a lot, but still Biden. Plus, the big problem that Democrats face is that they have a disadvantage in the electoral college, which means they got to win by probably at least 3 points to pull off a victory. At least that's what it's been the last several cycles, right? And so while he may be in toss-up zone or be up by a point or two in some national polling, that's not enough to put you up in the battleground states. And you've never seen him ahead in most of those battleground states. So when you're already behind and then you go out and do a debate performance like this that emphasizes your worst possible feature, right? The thing that most Americans are concerned about with you as a candidate. I don't know. How do you get back from that? Maybe, the country is so polarized at this point that it's possible that he but man, I don't know. Trump certainly played up some of the negative things that people don't like about him, with still standing by pardoning the January 6th rioters and lying about the election, all this stuff that people don't like, but he did it to a much lesser degree as far as than Biden emphasizing how old he was. Like, Trump's no spring chicken either, but he's certainly, the contrast between the two is clear, right?
I was going to say, even his worst parts of the performance, I think, were overshadowed, like you said, by just the negatives for Biden. So
It was
I
weird
don't know.
too, right? Like so it was just strange. Like Biden got better as he went along, which is odd. I think that I liked the format personally as a person who likes to focus more on the policy side than the spectacle aspects of debates. No audience made it less of a circus, like tend to devolve into, and then but it definitely seemed to suck a lot of the energy out of the two of them, which was probably a good thing for Trump to some degree and was a very bad thing for Biden, because when he went to the after party, he was more vibrant and coherent during his after party than he was at any point during the speech. During the debate. Same thing that he stopped at like a Waffle House and was interacting with people. He was much more, and that was much later. I don't know. I don't get it. It was very strange watching that aspect of it. But I think I don't know that you're going to find anyone out there who's going to tell you that Biden won the debate or that was a good night for him. In fact, most of the reaction I've seen from people in his own party,
It's panic.
yeah, they're freaking out, right? Like, and justifiably so, because again, he emphasized the worst aspect of his candidacy, which is that he is too old. He went up there and he looked and acted too old. And, sure, Trump didn't, I don't think he had a good debate either, but it's hard for any of that to break through. Like you can fact check Trump's numerous false claims all day long, but people who watch the debate, they're taking away. I mean, it was pretty early on, right? He had that moment where he just froze and ended with the bizarre thing about fighting Medicare. Just, I don't know, man. My main takeaway from all this stuff, and this is just personal. When it comes to the reload, like I try to stay in the reporting analyzing zone and focused on guns. And if you don't want to hear my political viewpoints on things, I think that's totally fine. And people can just skip this part of the podcast, hopefully. But, I try to be forward with I own guns. I build AR-15s, but I still try to do my best to be fair in my analysis and tell people what I think. And this is part of that, like my political worldview. And I just have been completely unhappy with our political choices for a long time now in this country. Like I can't see myself voting for either of these guys for different reasons, but for pretty strong reasons at that. And last night was just made me depressed to see that this is where we've arrived as a country, that debate, those choices.
Yeah, agrees.
So, and then of course that was on top. I was extra depressed because, my God, the Phillies played right before the debate and things were going great until we got to, I think it was the 7th inning, up 4-0. Made some bad calls, but then the Phillies gave up like 5 runs. And they came back and tied it. Then they gave up a home run. And then the last pitch of the game, Bryce Harper hits a ball that's for an out, but it was a close play at first. And so he was sprinting down the line and he pulled his hamstring. He did something to his hamstring and they lost. And Kyle Schwarber also was taken out earlier in the game. And that was after Spencer Turnbull was injured like the game before, and then Taiwan Walker was injured the game before that. So the Phillies are the best team in the MLB, and now they're saddled with a bunch of potentially serious injuries right before this disaster of a debate happened. And so it was a really tough night. My gosh. Wow. Anyway, if you feel like the two of us do, you feel a bit politically homeless in this place that we've arrived at as a country, one outlet that I would recommend is the Dispatch. And so I'm going to leave you guys with our ad for them. We're doing a promo swap, and I've got some good stuff to say about them here. I'll leave you with. That's right. This episode is brought to you by The Dispatch. We're doing one of these classic promo swaps with them, actually on Kevin Williamson's newsletter, which is one that I personally subscribe to and read pretty much every time it comes out. I've actually been a paying subscriber to The Dispatch since they launched. They have over 400,000 readers now. Jonah Goldberg and Steve Hayes and Chris Steyerwalt and Ala Pundin. There's so many people who write over there that I've long followed and respected and enjoyed their perspective. And of course, in addition to a lot of the great commentary that they have from people that you probably know better than me, the people who are more well-known than I, they also have a lot of really deep and original news reporting that they do. And so that's why I've been happy to have them as one of our sponsors, as a promo swap. I would definitely stand behind their work and recommend it to you guys in a way that I couldn't say for a lot of other publications out there. So, if you're interested in checking out The Dispatch, if you haven't heard of it before, or you haven't taken the time to go over and examine what they're bringing into the world from a journalistic standpoint, I think you should do it. And in fact, part of our promo swap includes a 30-day free trial for their paid version. So you'll get access to everything they have for free for 30 days. So you can read it and make up your own mind. Just follow the link in the description here or in our newsletter this week at The Reload. So that honestly, I just do legitimately recommend them. And so I'm glad to do this sort of promo swap because they're one of my favorite publications. And I think you guys will enjoy them if you enjoy what we do here at The Reload. So check out The Dispatch today at the link in our description.